My phone buzzed during lunch. A bank alert. I glanced at the screen and my stomach dropped. Transaction approved. $500,000 withdrawn from Patterson Industries' operating account. Authorized by Victoria Patterson and Amanda Patterson. My sisters. I stared at the numbers, reading them again and again, hoping I had misunderstood. But there was no mistake. $500,000. Gone. My hands started shaking. I looked up at the restaurant around me, at people eating and laughing like the world hadn't just shifted sideways. My father was supposed to announce his will today, in less than 2 hours. We were all meeting at his house at 3 o'clock. He'd called us yesterday, his voice serious but warm, saying he wanted to discuss the future of the business. And now this. My sisters had emptied the account minutes before he gathered us together. This wasn't a coincidence. This was calculated. I paid my bill quickly, barely tasting the coffee I'd ordered. My mind raced through possibilities, through explanations that might make sense. But every answer led back to the same ugly truth. They knew. They knew what Dad was planning to say, and they moved first. I arrived at my father's house early. The driveway already had 2 cars parked there. Victoria's sleek sedan and Amanda's SUV. They were inside, waiting. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Through the living room window, I could see them. Victoria sat on the couch, legs crossed, looking perfectly relaxed. Amanda stood near the fireplace, nodding at something Dad was saying. They looked normal, loving even, like devoted daughters visiting their father on a Sunday afternoon. My phone was still clutched in my hand, the bank alert burning a hole through my palm. Should I tell him now? Should I walk in there and show him what they'd done? But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Dad smiled at them, proud and trusting. Maybe it was the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. He'd been through so much already. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Victoria glanced toward the window as I approached, and for just a second, something flickered across her face. Not guilt, something harder. Then she smiled and waved. When Mom died 3 years ago, everything changed. The grief hit us all differently. Dad threw himself into work, using the business as a lifeline to keep from drowning. Victoria and Amanda drifted away. They attended the funeral, stayed for a week, then gradually disappeared back into their own lives. Victoria lived 2 hours away with her husband and kids. Amanda had just started a new job in the city. They had reasons, they said, responsibilities. I understood that, but I also stayed. I was the youngest, the one still figuring out my career, the one without a family of my own yet. So I became the one who showed up. I started helping Dad at the office, taking on small tasks at first, then bigger projects. Patterson Industries manufactured industrial equipment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, profitable, and it needed attention. Dad taught me everything. How to read contracts, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to manage inventory and logistics. Slowly, I learned the business from the ground up. My sisters sent flowers. They called on weekends. But I was the one who kept things running. Dad cleared his throat, and we all turned to face him. He stood near his desk, a folder in his hands. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Victoria and Amanda sat on the couch together. I took the armchair across from them. Dad looked at each of us, his expression serious but warm. He'd aged so much in 3 years. Gray had spread through his hair, and his shoulders carried a weight that hadn't been there before. But his eyes were clear, determined. He opened the folder and pulled out several papers. Legal documents. Official and heavy. He said he'd been thinking about the future, about the business, about what would happen when he was gone. His voice stayed steady, but I saw his hand tremble slightly. He said he wanted to divide ownership based on contribution, based on who had actually helped build and maintain Patterson Industries. Not equally, not automatically, but fairly. Victoria's jaw tightened. Amanda shifted in her seat. I kept my face neutral, but my heart pounded. Dad said he'd made his decision. He'd worked with lawyers. Everything was documented and legal. He just wanted us to understand his reasoning before he finalized it. The will would be signed tomorrow morning. After Dad finished talking, Victoria stood up first. She hugged him, her smile bright and loving. She said she understood completely, that it made perfect sense, that she was proud of him for thinking things through so carefully. Amanda nodded along, echoing her sister's words. They acted like the announcement had been expected, like they'd seen it coming all along. But I'd noticed the look they'd exchanged when Dad mentioned contribution. Just a glance, quick and loaded, passing between them like a silent conversation. When Dad went to the kitchen to make coffee, I followed Victoria into the hallway. I kept my voice low and asked her directly about the transfer, about the $500,000. She turned to me, her expression shifting from surprise to something that almost looked like amusement. She laughed, actually laughed. She said it was just accounting cleanup, moving funds between accounts for tax purposes. She said their names were on the authorization forms, so they'd handled it. Nothing to worry about. Her tone was casual, dismissive, like I was being paranoid for even asking. But I knew the business. I knew how our accounts worked. There was no legitimate reason to move that much money today. Not like this. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Victoria's laugh, about the way Amanda had avoided my eyes when I'd asked if she knew about the transfer. Something was deeply wrong, and I needed to understand it. I drove to the office at midnight. The building was dark and silent, but I had keys. I'd had them for 2 years. I went straight to my desk and opened my laptop. I started with emails, searching through years of correspondence, looking for patterns. What I found made my chest tighten. My name was everywhere, on purchase orders, on client communications, on supplier contracts. Nearly every major decision in the past 3 years had gone through me. I pulled up the company documents. Next, articles of incorporation, shareholder agreements, operating procedures. The business structure was clear. Dad owned 80%. Victoria, Amanda, and I each owned 5%. Small stakes we'd been given years ago. But the operational control, the actual authority to make decisions, that was where things got interesting. Dad had delegated most of his authority to me 18 months ago. It was in writing, signed and notarized. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was just paperwork reflecting reality. I dug deeper into the financial records. The $500,000 withdrawal wasn't the first unusual transaction. I found smaller amounts going back over a year. 10,000 here, 20,000 there. Always authorized by Victoria or Amanda, always labeled as business expenses or vendor payments. But when I cross-referenced them with actual invoices and receipts, nothing matched up. The money had been moved, but not spent on the business. It had been diverted, siphoned away gradually, carefully, like someone testing how much they could take before anyone noticed. The pattern was clear now. They'd been preparing for this, building confidence, learning the system, making sure they knew how to access the funds when the time came. And that time was today, right before Dad announced the will. The timing couldn't be accidental. They knew Dad was planning to give me control. Maybe they'd overheard something. Maybe they'd guessed based on how involved I'd become. Whatever the reason, they decided to take what they could before it was too late. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated theft. I thought back to those early days after Mom died, to how hard it had been for all of us. Dad had been lost, wandering through the house like a ghost. Some mornings I'd find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, his coffee cold in front of him. The business had been struggling too. Orders were getting mixed up. Clients were complaining. Suppliers were calling about late payments. Someone had to step in. I remembered calling Victoria and Amanda, asking them to help. Victoria had said her kids needed her right now, that she was dealing with her own grief and couldn't handle anything else. Amanda had said her new job was demanding, that she just started and couldn't take time off. They weren't lying exactly. Their reasons were real, but they were also choices. I'd chosen differently. I'd spent 16-hour days at the office, learning, fixing, rebuilding. And while I'd been doing that, they'd been living their lives, going on vacations, renovating their homes, moving forward. I'd thought they were coping in their own way. Now, I wondered if they'd been planning all along, if they'd seen Mom's death as an opportunity, a chance to distance themselves just enough to claim they weren't involved, while still holding onto their piece of the inheritance. The next morning, I went to Dad's house again. He was in his study, reviewing documents, preparing to sign the will. I stood in the doorway, watching him. He looked tired but content, proud even. He'd built something real with this business, and he wanted to make sure it survived him. I almost told him everything right then, almost showed him the bank alerts, the transaction history, the pattern of theft. But when he looked up and smiled at me, when I saw how much trust was in that smile, I hesitated. He'd already lost Mom, already spent 3 years grieving and rebuilding. Did I really want to add this weight to his shoulders? Did I want to be the one who destroyed his relationship with 2 of his daughters? I made a decision in that moment. I would wait. I would be patient. I would gather every piece of evidence I could find, and then I would present it all at once, cleanly, undeniably, so there could be no confusion about what had happened. Dad asked if I was okay. I nodded and said I was fine, just thinking about the future. He nodded back, understanding in his eyes. He said the future was in good hands. That afternoon, I stopped by Victoria's house unannounced. She answered the door with surprise on her face, but she invited me in. We sat in her kitchen, and she made tea. Small talk, surface-level pleasantries. Then I heard voices from the other room. Amanda's voice. They were both here, together. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead I stood quietly in the hallway. Their voices drifted through the door. Amanda was saying something about making sure everything was locked in before Dad changed his mind. Victoria responded that they'd done what they needed to do, that the money was already moved and protected, that by the time anyone figured it out, it wouldn't matter. Their tone wasn't worried. It was confident, almost celebratory. They thought they'd won. They thought the will wouldn't affect them because they'd already taken their share. They thought I was too young, too inexperienced, too trusting to understand what had happened. I walked back to the kitchen, thanked Victoria for the tea, and left. On the drive home, I felt something shift inside me. The doubt was gone. The hesitation had disappeared. I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I met with Catherine Torres, a corporate attorney I'd worked with on several business contracts. She specialized in business law and fiduciary duty. I laid everything out for her. The unauthorized withdrawals, the pattern over the past year, the timing relative to the will announcement. Catherine listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and nodded slowly. She said what my sisters had done was textbook breach of fiduciary duty. As shareholders, even small ones, they had a legal obligation to act in the company's best interests. Taking $500,000 for personal use was clear theft. She explained that the evidence I gathered was strong. Bank records, authorization forms, the lack of corresponding business expenses. Everything pointed to deliberate misappropriation of funds. She asked if I wanted to pursue criminal charges or handle it civilly. I said I wanted to recover the money first, make it right for Dad and the business. She nodded. She said we could start with a formal demand letter, legally require them to return the funds within a specific time frame. If they refused, we'd move to litigation. I signed the paperwork authorizing her to proceed. For the first time in days, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just reacting. I went back to work like nothing had changed. I showed up at the office every morning. I ran meetings. I checked inventory. I handled client calls. Dad noticed and commented on how steady I'd been, how reliable. He said it reminded him of Mom. That compliment hurt more than I expected. I kept thinking about how she would have handled this, whether she would have been disappointed in Victoria and Amanda, or whether she would have found some way to excuse their behavior. But Mom wasn't here, and I had to make my own decisions now. Victoria called me once during that week. She asked if everything was okay at the office. I said everything was fine. She asked if Dad had signed the will yet. I said he had. She was quiet for a moment, then said she hoped there wouldn't be any hard feelings about how things turned out. I told her I didn't have any feelings about it at all, which was technically true. I didn't have feelings. I had evidence. Amanda sent a text a few days later, just checking in, seeing how the business was doing, making sure I wasn't overwhelmed. I sent back a brief, polite response. They had no idea what was coming. 2 weeks after the will was signed, I initiated a routine internal audit. It was within my authority as operations manager. Standard business practice. Nothing unusual about it. I hired an outside accounting firm to review our financials for the past 2 years. They were thorough and professional. Within 3 days, they flagged multiple irregularities, unauthorized transfers, missing documentation, suspicious vendor payments that didn't match up with purchase orders. They asked if I wanted them to investigate further. I said yes. The full audit took another week. The results were devastating. Over $600,000 had been improperly withdrawn from company accounts over the past 18 months. Most of it in the last 6 months. All of it authorized by either Victoria or Amanda. The auditors prepared a detailed report. Every transaction was documented. Every inconsistency highlighted. Every piece of missing paperwork noted. It was professional, objective, damning. I presented the report to Dad on a Tuesday afternoon. He read through it slowly, his expression changing from confusion to disbelief to something harder, colder. When he finished, he looked up at me. He asked how long I'd known. I told him about the bank alert, about the timing, about what I'd overheard. His hands shook as he set the report down. While the audit was happening, My sister's behavior changed. Victoria bought a new car. Expensive. Luxury brand. She posted photos on social media, showing it off with a big smile. Amanda renovated her kitchen. Complete overhaul. Custom cabinets. High-end appliances. She hired a professional photographer to document the before and after. They weren't even trying to hide it. They were spending the money openly, confidently, like they had every right to it. I wondered if they thought the will protected them somehow, if they believed that once the inheritance was divided, no one would bother checking where the money had come from. Or maybe they just didn't think anyone was paying attention. They'd gotten away with smaller amounts for so long that they'd grown careless, overconfident. Each purchase they made was another piece of evidence, another transaction that could be traced directly back to the stolen funds. They were building the case against themselves and didn't even realize it. I watched their social media updates with a kind of detached fascination. Every post, every photo, every comment was another nail in the coffin of their defense. 3 weeks after the will was signed, Dad called another family meeting. This time, his tone was different, colder, more formal. Victoria and Amanda showed up looking confident, almost smug. I think they thought this meeting was about finalizing the inheritance distribution, about officially transferring shares. Dad didn't waste time. He opened with a simple statement. He said he'd become aware of significant financial irregularities in the business, that an audit had been conducted, that the results were troubling. Victoria's smile faltered. Amanda's eyes widened slightly. Dad handed them each a copy of the audit report. He told them to read it carefully. The room was silent except for the sound of pages turning. I watched their faces change as they read. Confusion, then recognition, then something like panic trying hard to stay hidden. Victoria finished first. She looked up and said there must be some mistake, that she'd only authorized legitimate business expenses. Amanda nodded quickly, agreeing. They'd been helping, they said, trying to manage things while I was learning. Dad didn't argue. He just pulled out another folder. Bank statements, transaction records, everything I'd gathered over the past weeks. He asked them to explain each withdrawal, to provide receipts, to show where the money had gone. They couldn't. Victoria tried anger first. She said I'd manipulated this whole situation, that I'd deliberately turned Dad against them, that I'd orchestrated the audit to make them look bad. She accused me of being jealous, of wanting the business all to myself, of using Mom's death to worm my way into Dad's trust. Amanda joined in, though her voice was quieter, less certain. She said I'd always been Dad's favorite, that he'd never appreciated what they'd sacrificed, that I'd had it easier because I was younger. Their words washed over me without landing. I didn't respond, didn't defend myself, didn't explain. I just sat there, calm and silent, while they tried to rewrite history in real time. Dad listened to all of it. Then he asked a simple question. Where was the money? If they'd used it for legitimate business expenses, where were the receipts? Where were the invoices? Where was the documentation? They didn't have answers, just more accusations, more blame, more attempts to shift focus away from what they'd actually done. Finally, Dad stood up. He said he'd heard enough, that he was disappointed, that he'd expected better from them. The meeting ended with Victoria slamming the door on her way out. Amanda followed, more slowly, tears streaming down her face. 2 days later, I sat down with Dad and showed him everything, not just the audit report, but the full timeline, The bank alert from the day of the will announcement, the pattern of smaller withdrawals over the previous year, the evidence of planning and calculation. I showed him the emails I'd found, the records of authorization, the lack of any legitimate business purpose for the transfers. Dad studied every document carefully. He asked questions. He wanted to understand exactly how it had happened, how they'd gotten access, how they'd hidden it for so long. I explained the authorization structure, how their names had been on certain forms as legacy shareholders, how the system assumed family members would act in good faith, how they'd exploited that trust. When I finished, Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He thanked me. He said if I hadn't caught it, if I hadn't cared enough to investigate, the business might have been destroyed. He said Mom would be proud of me, that I'd protected something important, something that mattered to both of them. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them away. This wasn't about praise. It was about what was right. Understanding what had happened changed something in Dad. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was about the timing. They'd stolen from him minutes before he tried to do something meaningful with his legacy. They'd exploited his trust on the exact day he was trying to make things fair. He'd thought carefully about the will, about how to divide things in a way that reflected reality rather than obligation. He'd wanted to honor contribution rather than just blood relation. And they'd seen that coming and decided to take what they could before he had the chance. That hurt him more than the actual theft. It revealed how they saw him, not as a father trying to do right by his children, but as an asset to be exploited, a resource to be drained before he could distribute it differently. He'd been preparing to reward me for the work I'd done. They'd been preparing to steal what they thought they deserved. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. That night, Dad made a decision. He called Catherine Torres himself. He said he wanted to pursue full legal action, not just civil recovery, but criminal charges if appropriate. He wanted accountability. He wanted consequences. I understood why. Catherine moved quickly. Within days, formal demand letters went out to both Victoria and Amanda, legal documents requiring them to return the stolen funds within 30 days or face litigation. The letters detailed every unauthorized transaction, every piece of evidence, every legal violation. They were thorough and uncompromising. Victoria's response came first, through her own lawyer, a long letter claiming misunderstanding, claiming she'd been authorized, claiming she'd acted in good faith. But it was all deflection, no actual explanation for where the money went or why it was taken. No receipts, no documentation, just excuses. Amanda called Dad directly. She was crying, apologizing, saying she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd been stressed about money and made bad decisions, that she'd let Victoria convince her it was okay. She begged for mercy, for understanding, for a chance to make things right. Dad listened. Then he told her the only way to make things right was to return the money, all of it, immediately. She said she couldn't. She'd already spent most of her share. The renovation, the new furniture, a vacation she'd taken last month. It was gone. Dad hung up. The family fractured along predictable lines. Aunts and uncles took sides. Some called me ruthless, said I was destroying the family over money, said I should forgive and move on. Others stayed quiet, waiting to see how things played out. But a few reached out privately. They said they'd noticed things too, small inconsistencies, stories that didn't quite add up, spending that didn't match reported income. They'd wondered, but hadn't wanted to interfere. One of Dad's brothers sent him the audit report, just passed it along without comment to several extended family members. Within a week, the whispers changed. People started understanding what had actually happened. That this wasn't about favoritism or jealousy or sibling rivalry. It was about theft, deliberate, calculated, timed perfectly to cause maximum damage. The silence that followed was different than the arguing had been. It was the silence of understanding, of people realizing they'd been defending the wrong side. Not everyone changed their mind. Some family members were too invested in their initial position to back down. But enough people saw the truth that the pressure shifted. Victoria and Amanda found themselves increasingly isolated. Catherine filed the lawsuit 8 weeks after the initial demand letter. Patterson Industries versus Victoria Patterson and Amanda Patterson. Civil action for breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of corporate funds, and fraud. The filing was public, detailed, devastating. Within hours of the filing, the court approved our request to freeze their accounts pending resolution. Victoria couldn't access her savings. Amanda couldn't use her credit cards. Everything was locked down until the money could be recovered. Catherine also filed liens against their properties. The new car Victoria had bought, the renovated kitchen in Amanda's house, the vacation home they'd jointly purchased 2 months earlier. All of it became collateral. All of it could be seized to recover the stolen funds. They tried to fight it, hired lawyers, filed counter motions, claimed the freezes were excessive, that we were punishing them unfairly, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge reviewed the audit report, the bank records, the transaction history. He ruled in our favor on every preliminary motion. The case was moving forward. Fast. Their lawyers started making settlement offers, first returning half the money, then 75%, then everything except what they'd already spent. Catherine rejected each offer. We wanted full recovery, plus legal fees, plus damages for the harm they'd caused. Nothing less would do. 3 months into the legal proceedings, my phone rang late one night. Amanda's number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying, really crying. Not the performative tears from before, but deep, broken sobs. She said she was sorry, that she never meant for things to go this far, that Victoria had convinced her it would be fine, that no one would notice. She said she'd been jealous, that watching me work with Dad had made her feel left out, that seeing him proud of me had hurt because she wanted that too, but didn't know how to earn it. She said taking the money had felt like taking back something that should have been hers anyway, like evening the score. But now she understood how wrong that was, how much damage she caused, how badly she betrayed Dad's trust. She asked what she could do to make things right. I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said one sentence, the only sentence that mattered. I told her she didn't steal money. She stole trust, and that cost more than any dollar amount. Then I hung up. I didn't block her number. I didn't need to. That conversation was finished. The legal proceedings continued for another 4 months. Discovery, depositions, expert testimony. Every piece of evidence was examined. Every transaction was analyzed. Every excuse was dismantled. The truth was undeniable. Victoria and Amanda had stolen over $600,000 from Patterson Industries over 18 months. They had violated their fiduciary duty as shareholders. They had betrayed their father's trust. They had exploited their mother's death. The judge ordered full restitution. Every dollar returned, plus legal fees, plus 20% in damages. The total came to over $750,000. Their properties were liquidated. Victoria's new car was sold. Amanda's house went on the market. The vacation home was auctioned. Every asset they'd purchased with the stolen money was seized and converted to cash. The money was returned to Patterson Industries in full. The business was made whole. Dad was vindicated. After the final settlement was approved, Victoria and Amanda stepped away from the business entirely. They sold their shares back to the company. They signed agreements never to claim any future interest in Patterson Industries. They walked away with nothing except their reputations in ruins. Dad didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He just looked tired, sad, like he'd won something but lost something bigger. I understood. Family was supposed to be permanent, unbreakable, but sometimes people break it themselves. In the year that followed, Patterson Industries thrived. Without the drain of unauthorized withdrawals, our cash flow stabilized. Without the distraction of family drama, we could focus on growth. We landed 3 major new contracts. We expanded our manufacturing capacity. We hired additional staff. Revenue grew by 30%. Dad gradually stepped back from daily operations. He spent more time with friends, traveled a little, let himself rest for the first time in years. He officially promoted me to vice president, gave me full operational control in writing, updated the succession plan to reflect reality. I hired a new CFO, someone outside the family, someone with no emotional investment in our history, someone who would catch problems before they became crises. We implemented new financial controls, new oversight procedures, new checks and balances. The business became more professional, more stable, more protected. Some people asked if I felt guilty, if I regretted how things had turned out, if I wished I'd handled it differently. I didn't. I protected what my parents built together. I preserved Mom's legacy. I'd ensured Dad could retire with dignity instead of watching his life's work dissolve into nothing. That wasn't revenge. That was responsibility. 2 years after everything fell apart, I sat in Dad's study looking at old photos. Mom was in most of them, smiling, vibrant, alive. I wondered what she would have thought about how things ended, whether she would have been disappointed in Victoria and Amanda, whether she would have been proud of me. Dad walked in and sat down beside me. He'd been thinking about the same things. He said Mom always knew who people really were, that she'd loved all of us but hadn't been blind to our flaws. He thought she would have been sad about what happened, but not surprised. She'd always said character revealed itself under pressure, that grief and money showed you who people really were. She'd been right. We sat together quietly for a while. Then Dad said something I hadn't expected. He said he was grateful, not for the betrayal, not for the pain, but for the clarity, for finally understanding what mattered and what didn't. He said he'd spent too many years confusing obligation with relationship, confusing blood with loyalty. Now he knew the difference. I nodded. I'd learned the same thing. Family wasn't just who you were born to. It was who showed up, who stayed, who protected what mattered when it would have been easier to walk away. They thought blood meant ownership. I proved contribution is what counts.